If you're studying A-level philosophy or religious studies, subscribe. I'm covering the entire course on this channel. John Stuart Mill, Higher and Lower Pleasures. Previously, we've looked at Jeremy Bentham and the hedonic calculus, where Bentham tried to measure pleasure quantitatively. In other words, by calculating how much pleasure an action produces. However, another utilitarian philosopher, John Stuart Mill, believed Bentham's approach was too simplistic. Mill agreed that the goal of morality is to maximize happiness, but he argued that not all pleasures are equal. Some forms of happiness, he believed, are more valuable than others. And this idea led Mill to introduce one of the most famous distinctions in utilitarian ethics: the difference between higher pleasures and lower pleasures. Understanding this distinction is crucial because it shows how utilitarianism evolved from Bentham's original theory. So who was John Stuart Mill? Well, he lived from 1806 to 1873, and he became one of the most influential philosophers of the 19th century. His childhood was extremely unusual. His father, James Mill, believed that he could create a philosophical genius and began educating his son intensely from a very young age. Mill reportedly began learning ancient Greek at the age of 3, and he was studying philosophy, logic, and political economy much before children had ever even started school. However, this intense education came at a cost. In his early 20s, Mill suffered a serious mental breakdown, partly because of the pressure that was placed on him. And that experience deeply influenced his thinking. It helped him realize that human happiness is more complex than Bentham's purely quantitative approach suggested. And so he introduced this crucial distinction between quality and quantity of pleasure. So, what was his contribution to utilitarianism? His problem with Bentham's theory? Well, Mill did not reject utilitarianism. He tried to improve and he tried to refine it. He believed that Bentham's theory was right to focus on happiness as the ultimate goal of morality. However, Bentham treated all pleasures as if they were essentially the same, simply different in amount. And Mill believed that this view ignored an important feature of human life: the qualitative differences between types of pleasures. In other words, some pleasures are not just greater in quantity, but they are better in kind. And so Bentham's quantitative utilitarianism is often criticized. And this means that pleasures are evaluated purely in terms of how much pleasure they produce. He famously suggested that if two activities produce the same amount of pleasure, they are morally equal. And this led critics to accuse him of reducing human happiness to something rather very shallow. For example, Bentham once implied that a simple game could be just as valuable as reading poetry if it produced the same amount of pleasure. Mill believed this view ignored something essential about human nature. And partly because watching reality TV, for example, in today's world is equal to reading Shakespeare if the pleasure quantity is the same, which is clearly problematic. And so Mill offered a solution. He introduced qualitative distinctions. Some pleasures are inherently superior to others. So let's compare this quantitative versus qualitative utilitarianism. We've already mentioned Bentham's quantitative approach, that all pleasures differ only in the amount. He used the hedonic calculus, and you can watch my other video to learn more about that, to measure happiness. The pushpin is the reference to the simple game that I just mentioned, where he considered it just as good as poetry if it produced equal pleasure. And he said literally this: quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry. Let's compare that then to Mill's qualitative approach. Mill's solution was to argue that pleasures differ not only in quantity but quality. So this means that some pleasures are intrinsically more valuable than others. He believed that pleasures involving our intellectual and moral faculties are superior to purely physical pleasures. So activities like learning, creativity, and philosophical reflection contribute to a richer, more meaningful form of happiness. And Mill therefore developed what we call qualitative utilitarianism, which evaluates pleasure not just by how much there is, but by the type of pleasure that is involved. So let's have a look at his distinction. He defines the difference between higher and lower pleasures. He described intellectual and cultural pleasures as the higher pleasures. So these include things like education, art, literature, philosophical thinking, moral reflection. Mill believed these pleasures are superior because they engage our higher human capacities, like reasoning, imagination, and moral awareness. Now, these pleasures may sometimes involve effort or even frustration, but they contribute to a deeper form of human flourishing. Mill believed people who experience these pleasures tend to recognize their value and prefer them over purely physical pleasures. Compare that to lower pleasures. These are the more basic forms of pleasure that humans share with animals. These include things like eating, drinking, physical comfort, and simple entertainment. Mill didn't argue that these pleasures are bad, he just said that they are genuine sources of happiness, but he believed they are less valuable than the pleasures that engage our intellectual capacities. So Mill thought that if someone had experienced both types of pleasure, they would normally recognize that higher pleasures provide a more meaningful form of happiness. He famously said, "It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." Now, what did he mean by that? Well, what he meant is that a life filled with simple pleasures but lacking the intellectual depth is ultimately less valuable than a life that involves thought, reflection, and personal development. Even if the intellectual life is something that brings frustration or dissatisfaction, it still represents a higher form of happiness. And this quote beautifully illustrates Mill's belief that the quality of pleasure matters more than simple quantity. Mill supported his argument with the idea of the competent judge's test. How do we determine which of these pleasures then are higher? Now, competent judges are people who have experienced both higher and lower pleasures and are therefore capable of comparing them. These are experienced people. So we should consult those who have experienced both types of pleasure. Mill argued that when people who have experienced both types of pleasure are asked which they prefer, they consistently favour the higher pleasures. And they can make informed comparisons and preferences. And whichever pleasure they prefer is going to be objectively higher in quantity. Now, for example, someone who has experienced intellectual satisfaction and simple physical pleasure will often recognize that intellectual fulfillment is going to be more meaningful. And this argument allowed Mill to defend the idea that some pleasures are objectively better than others. So what are the strengths of Mill's theory? Well, one of the strengths is that it helps utilitarianism avoid what critics have called the swine ethic objection. Bentham's theory was criticized for suggesting that human happiness is no different from the pleasures that animals experience. If morality is simply about maximizing pleasure, as Bentham said, then critics argue human life becomes little more than sophisticated pleasure seeking. And Mill tries to solve this problem by recognizing that humans have distinct intellectual and moral capabilities. According to Mill, pleasures that engage our ability to think, reflect, create, and learn are fundamentally more valuable than simple bodily pleasures. And in this way, utilitarianism can defend the idea that human life involves more than just satisfying your appetite. And a second strength is that Mill's theory reflects our common moral intuition. Most people already believe that some activities are more worthwhile than others. For example, many people would say that reading literature, learning a new language, appreciating art contributes more to a meaningful life than simply consuming entertainment. Mill's theory aligns with the everyday intuition that some forms of happiness are going to be more deeper and more fulfilling than others. And a third strength is that Mill's theory promotes what philosophers call human flourishing. If you emphasize the intellectual and the moral development, Mill encourages you to cultivate your abilities and pursue activities that contribute to your own personal growth. And this idea later influenced thinkers in educational philosophy. The idea that education, culture, intellectual development will improve the quality of your life is very much in line with Mill's vision of higher pleasures. And finally, Mill's theory still maintains the core utilitarian principle that morality should aim to maximize happiness. He hasn't abandoned that Bentham approach. He refines it. And by redefining happiness in terms of higher and lower pleasures, he attempts to preserve the central goal of utilitarian ethics whilst addressing the weaknesses of Bentham. But it goes without saying there are criticisms and there are problems. Despite that, one criticism is that the theory may appear elitist and paternalistic. Mill argues that intellectual pleasures are superior to simpler pleasures. But critics ask an important question. Who decides what counts as a higher pleasure? Now, if philosophers or educated elites decide that intellectual activities are superior, this could impose their values on people who genuinely prefer simpler forms of enjoyment. Critics sometimes ask whether Mill is simply expressing the tastes of an educated 19th century intellectual. In other words, was he being a snob? A second criticism is that Mill's theory may actually contradict the core principle of utilitarianism. Bentham's version of utilitarianism was strongly democratic because it treated every person's pleasure as equally valuable. However, if some pleasures are intrinsically better than others, Mill seems to introduce a hierarchy of pleasures that may undermine Bentham's original principle that every person counts equally. And another problem is the competent judge problem, which I previously highlighted. Mill argues that people who have experienced both higher and lower pleasures will prefer the higher ones. However, in reality, many people who've experienced intellectual pleasures still will choose simpler forms of enjoyment. We can just take a look at the student who would probably much prefer to go play video games or watch Netflix or do something with their friends that's enjoyable than sit and revise their subject. It's a natural inclination. So, for example, someone who enjoys philosophy or literature might still spend most of their free time choosing to watch TV or play games. Now, critics therefore question whether Mill's competent judge argument actually proves that higher pleasures are objectively superior. And finally, there's the problem that Mill's theory is just simply difficult to apply in practice. Bentham attempted to provide a systematic calculation using the hedonic calculus. But once we introduce qualitative differences between pleasures, it becomes very hard to measure happiness. And if we cannot easily compare the quality of different pleasures, the utilitarian calculation becomes even more complicated, and in case you may not have realized, in some cases, impossible to apply. Now, why does this all matter for your A-level essays? Well, one very common exam task, if you're thinking about higher and lower pleasures, is to compare and contrast Bentham and Mill's approaches to utilitarianism. Bentham represents what we call quantitative utilitarianism, where pleasure is measured purely in terms of how much there is. And Mill, by contrast, develops qualitative utilitarianism, arguing that some pleasures are inherently more valuable than others. And another important exam question is whether Mill successfully improves utilitarianism. Some philosophers think that Mill strengthens the theory by recognizing the richness of human happiness, while other people think he creates new problems by introducing subjective judgments about which pleasures are more superior than others. You could also be asked in your exams to discuss whether the distinction between higher and lower pleasures is elitist or justified. Critics often argue that Mill may be privileging the intellectual activities associated with educated elites, whereas supporters will argue that he's simply recognizing that human flourishing involves developing our intellectual and our moral capabilities. Examiners also like to see you apply the theory to ethical dilemmas. For example, when thinking about issues like education policy, cultural funding, or even everyday lifestyle choices, we might ask whether the quality of happiness matters, not just the quantity. It's also useful to link Mill's ideas to later developments in utilitarian thinking, such as rule or preference utilitarianism, which try to refine how happiness should be understood and maximized. Now, when you're structuring your essays, it's always important to define at the beginning higher and lower pleasures clearly. Explain Mill's argument about competent judges and use the famous Socratic quote that supports and is used as evidence. Strong essays will also include both philosophical examples and everyday examples, showing that you understand how the theory works in practice. And finally, remember that examiners want to see not just explanation, but also evaluation. You should aim to reach a reasoned conclusion about whether Mill genuinely improves utilitarianism or whether his modifications create new difficulties. And if you can explain the theory clearly and critically evaluate its strengths and weaknesses, you will be in a strong position to write an excellent A-level philosophy essay.